Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to the End of the Decade book tag. This tag was created by Brews and Review, so I will leave her link down in the description box for you so you can go and check her out as well. But given that it is now 2020 and it's the end of an entire decade, I thought I would kind of wrap up my reading. So I started using Goodreads a couple of years ago, so I only have a full-fledged 3 or 4 year chart when it comes to Goodreads and tracking my reading. So let's see how this tag goes and let's see what I can remember. Let's get into the categories because this is split into multiple. So the 3 categories are split into 2010 to 2013 and then 2014 to 2016, and then last it's split into 2017 to 2019. So each of these categories has the same 5 questions in each, and obviously the questions just pertain to the reading that I did in those chunks of time. So we're getting into 2010 to 2013, and the first question is, how many books did you read in this time? I looked at my Goodreads and I looked at these questions before I sat down to film this video, so I have a few things mapped out in my answers, but I believe that I read about 12 books in that time, but I probably read more. It's highly likely I read more than that, but from what I put into Goodreads, I read 12. Question number 2 is, what genre did you read the most in that time? And I would have to say urban fantasy. I was borrowing a lot of vampire fiction, and that seemed to be the craze at the time, especially with Twilight. I think I got into Twilight when I was in year 8 at school, so that would have been when I was about 14 years old, maybe 15 or 13, but around that time. And I was also big on dystopian and apocalyptic books then, because that's when I got into The Hunger Games and Divergent as well. Question number 3 for this category is, what was your favorite author back then? And I didn't really have a favorite author, I don't think. I did read a lot of Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia, but those really weren't favorite authors. They were just series that I was really into at the time and I would reread quite a lot. And Alex Rider as well, I was into that quite significantly. But the book that I looked back and found on my Goodreads is actually I Am the Messenger by Marcus Zusak, and he's the author of The Book Thief, which is his more known book, but I didn't know about that book at the time and I've since read it anyway, and historical fiction isn't really my thing, so I liked I Am the Messenger a lot more because it's a more contemporary story and it deals with this character's identity and how he interacts with the world, and he receives these playing cards and he has to correspond them to his real life, and I just really liked the touches it had on identity and it really resonated with me. So at the time I said that Marcus Zusak was my favorite author, but really I just meant that I Am the Messenger was my favorite book at that time. Question number 4 is there a book that you wish that you'd read during this time period? And I've got it written down that I wish I read Ursula K. Le Guin, I think that's how I pronounce her name, mostly because she is a fantasy author, but she wrote fantasy for younger audiences and middle grade audiences, and I think if I had read her books then, because I haven't read them at all, then I probably would have gotten into fantasy a lot sooner and I would have discovered a lot more fantasy a lot sooner. And I also want to mention His Dark Materials because I've been reading that at the end of 2019 and at the start of 2020, and I can just see that if I'd read that a lot sooner, then I would be a lot more obsessed with it and it would have all of the nostalgia that I associate with the Chronicles of Narnia, but it's a really inverse version of the Chronicles of Narnia because they're fighting actively against religion, whereas the Chronicles of Narnia is quite for religion and has that a bit on a pedestal. And coming from a non-religious background, I think I would have really loved both and to see the contrast of both. And then question number 5 is, do you have any regrets about this reading period? And I think I've mentioned it before, but I wish that I got into fantasy a bit earlier. And I also wish that I got into Goodreads a bit earlier because if I had, then I would have more of a record of what I was reading at the time, and it's pretty sparse if I look back on it. So the next category is 2014 to 2016, and the questions remain the same. So the first question is, how much did you read? So I've actually written down my stats and I'm not going to be able to remember this and talk to the camera, so I'm just going to have to read it off my phone. But from reading 4 books in 2014, that earlier reading period where my Goodreads is pretty sparse, I then went on to read 28 books, and that's what I recorded. And then after that, I got into a huge kick because I remember doing my honours thesis for literary studies in 2015, and I was doing a lot of academic reading, but not a lot of reading for pleasure. So I went from studying all of 2015 and then into 2016 when I could suddenly read for leisure again, and I was devouring everything, and I read 121 books in 2016. Question number 2 is, what genre did you read the most? And I definitely had my fantasy kick that year because that is the first year that I read Stormlight and effectively discovered Brandon Sanderson, and he is one of my favourite authors. I also discovered another favourite, The Name of the Wind, that year. So I am obsessed with that book, and I can't believe that I discovered it so late, I guess, given how popular and well known of a book it is. And also I started to read a bit more outside of fantasy, so science fiction reads pop up on my Goodreads around this time, especially Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, and that's the sequel to Illuminae. So I was reading young adult stuff and adult stuff a lot around that time too, because I'm kind of transitioning from reading a ton of young adult in my earlier reading to reading adult now that I'm more of an adult, but I still like both categories. Question number 3 is, what are your favorite authors of that time? And from such a wide range to choose from, I said Brandon Sanderson before, but I also want to say Becky Chambers, because that is the year that I read The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and then the rest of that series, and I adore that series. It's so beautiful. It follows these characters as they go on a long haul into space, and they're basically punching wormholes through space so that other craft after them can get from point A to point B a lot quicker, but they've got to do the long haul in order to make point A and point B connect. So you see a lot of different cultures, and it's very diverse in its portrayal of sexuality and gender and inclusivity, and just expanding your mind to think more humanly, I guess, about everything that you encounter on a day-to-day basis and things we kind of take for granted. And I just really love that series. It's so wholesome and it just makes my heart really full. So go and read it if you haven't. Question number 4 is there a book that you wish you'd read during this time period? And I read this book recently and I wish I'd read it then, but it's the 5th season and basically the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. That was a brilliant apocalyptic fantasy series, and I didn't know that apocalyptic fantasy was a thing, as well as this story being incredibly diverse and incredibly character nuanced and focused as well, and it became one of my favourites of 2019. So I wish that I'd read that earlier, just because I wish I'd kind of discovered that subgenre of fantasy earlier as well, especially with apocalyptic and fantasy, because I thought dystopian was over here and fantasy was over here and they were two separate genres, but the fact that they could be combined, amazing. Question number 5 is, do you have any regrets about your reading during this period? And I'm actually really proud of the fact that I read 121 books, because I wasn't sure whether I could even get to 100 books in a year, but it turns out I can, and I can exceed that number. So some years I've read around 70-ish books and some years I've read over 100 books. So it's just nice to know that I've got that range if I decide to push myself. But as for regrets, I wish I'd discovered audiobooks a lot sooner, because I kind of put them off. I'm not sure why. I just decided that I didn't like them and I hadn't even tried them. And I only really got into them in like 2016, 2017 when I was catching the train in and out of the city to go to work. And I wish I'd discovered it sooner, because if I discovered them sooner, then I could have listened to them on my way to and from university when I was doing my honours degree. And it just would have meant that I could listen to books that were for leisure rather than just reading for academic for the entire year. So that is definitely a regret. I wish I'd discovered audiobooks sooner, because they really, really boost my reading. And now we are into the third of the 3 categories, which is 2017 to 2019. Question number 1 is, how much did you read? And in 2019, I read 74 books. And then in 2018, I believe I read 130 books. And then the year before that, I don't remember, but I think it's around 73. So because of that pattern, I am really hoping that in 2020 I can get to 100 books, because I've already read a couple this year, so I'm making some headway. And I'm sure you know by now, but I definitely read a ton of fantasy. Fantasy is my favourite genre, so that's not really a surprise. Question number 3 is, what were your favourite books and authors for this category or this time period? I discovered Spellslinger by Sebastian de Castell in 2018, and that is my favourite fantasy young adult series. It's my favourite. I read the conclusion to it at the beginning of this year, and all of the books in the series have been 5 out of 5 stars for me. And his adult series, The Greatcoats, and the first book in that is Trader's Blade, favourites as well. So Sebastian de Castell is definitely up there, and whatever he writes, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to pre-order it, it's going to be mine, because he's definitely become one of my favourites recently. Question number 4 is there a book that you wish you'd read in this time period? And I mean, yes and no. I've been very strict with my book buying and my to be read pile, because it got way out of hand a couple of years ago and it was at 205 books, and I've cut that right back until the point where it's just about at 60 books. Maybe it's under 60 by the time this video goes live. As for books I wish I'd read during that time period, I just wish that I hadn't bought so many. So I kind of wish that I'd read my entire TBR, but I know that that's kind of impossible given that it's a bit of a stretch stretch for me to reach about 100 books a year, and I had quite a lot on my list to read, as well as new releases and rereads and all that kind of thing. So I think so far I've done fairly well, and I'm aiming to get that down as far as possible. I really want to get my TBR to 0, but I'm aiming for 30 by the end of 2020. Question number 5 is, do you have any regrets about your reading during this time period? And like I said in the previous question, my only regret is buying so many books so that I have to be held accountable to read all of them and unhaul them as well, because I haven't kept all of the books that I've bought over the years, mostly because I know my tastes have changed, so I haven't held on to stuff because I've had books for more than a couple of years. And honestly, if I haven't read it and it's been more than 5 years, then why would I still be holding on to it? So that has really revolutionized my reading, and my regret is definitely buying a ton of stuff, because once I've bought it, the money's gone. So I could have saved so much money because my reading taste changed. So that would definitely be a regret of mine. But at the same time, I enjoyed the experience of getting a package in the mail. So that's kind of the silver lining, but probably won't be going crazy on book buying in the future. My other regret about this time period is that I wish I'd read The Diviners by Libba Bray earlier, and I wish I'd read The Wheel of Time earlier, because I've read all of the Elderling series for Robin Hobb, and I've read all of Brandon Sanderson's work, and The Wheel of Time seems like another major long haul series that I just wish I'd started earlier. I'm planning on starting the series early 2020, so by the time this video goes up, I will be on my holiday overseas, so I might not have started it yet, but the plan is to start The Wheel of Time Book 1, Eye of the World, around February. So I don't know how quickly I'm going to get through the series, but I just wish I'd read it sooner, but I'm making up for it now. Okay, so we've come to the end of the 3 reading categories, but there are additional questions after this that are more general, so there's 2 of them. So the first question is, when did you find Booktube and did it change your reading habits? I found Booktube probably in 2015, around the time that I was finishing my undergraduate degree at uni and then starting my honours. So 2014, 2015. And I remember finding one of Regan's videos from Peruse Project, and she read fantasy, she read a bunch of stuff that I love reading, and so I was hooked immediately. And a lot of the books that she talked about in a book haul, I just went out and bought, and Booktube has definitely influenced me in that way. So early on, I went on a huge buying spree, like I said, and I just bought all of the stuff that Booktube has recommended to me because I didn't know my personal tastes. I would also say that in addition to Booktube, I also started a Bookstagram at that time, and keeping up with photos and taking new photos and producing new content all the time made me want to buy more books, so I had more things to take photos of. So I think Booktube and Bookstagram kind of went hand in hand with influencing me on buying a ton of books at that time. And then question number 2 is, how do you think your reading has changed over the last decade? And that's a really hard question to answer without considering my life changing as well, because I started reading years ago, and over the past decade I was like 13 or 14 and I'm 26 now. So my reading has changed definitely as I've grown up. I loved reading Alex Rider and Cherub, which is middle grade stories about child spies, and I also loved Harry Potter, and that's a urban fantasy middle grade. So I know in those books when they painted a picture about particular characters or archetypes or tropes or settings, I could kind of cherry pick from all of that stuff that I read earlier and apply it to what I read now, and I've really honed in on what my tastes are. And in addition to that, I've stopped majorly going overboard with book hauls like I mentioned, and I'm also not afraid to DNF books, and that means do not finish. So if I'm reading a book and I get like 10% in or 50 pages in or maybe even less and I'm not liking it, then I'm not hooked, and I won't be afraid of removing it from my Goodreads shelf, from just stopping reading it, and from donating it, giving it to a friend, or just unhauling it. And that's actually quite therapeutic, and it's really freed me from feeling responsible for having a ton of stuff on my shelves. And it's just really cathartic to get rid of a book that you don't like, because it makes room for books that you do like. And I've definitely embraced doing that in the past year or so, because I've had to with the amount of books that I hauled over the years. And also, kind of linking to the unhauling thing and the major book haul thing, I've stopped being influenced by all of the titles that get hyped up on book Twitter, on Booktube, and on Bookstagram, because usually there are key titles by popular authors, or just a book that everyone seems to be reading at the same time because it's a new release and everyone wants to read it at the same time. But if I look into it and the synopsis isn't really for me, then I don't go out of my way to go and buy it and see what I think, because one, I'm still trying to read all of the books that I physically own, and two, I probably won't like it or I won't love it. I like reading books that are at least a 4 stars, if not a 5-star rating, and if I go out and buy a book randomly that everyone is hyping up, more often than not it's like a 3 or 3.5 stars, because I have a bit of hit and miss luck with young adult fantasy, and a lot of these titles tend to be young adult or new adult fantasy, and I think there's the potential there to surprise me, but I also don't want to go out of my way and spend money on a book that I don't think I will absolutely adore. And there you go, that brings me to the end of the decade book tag. So that is it for all of the questions and all of the categories. Definitely let me know if you want to do this tag as well, because consider yourself tagged. I'll leave all of the information down in the description bar below, so let me know if you participate. I would love to see your video, but I'll chat to you in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.